Good morning, colleagues. My name is Galaletsang Keebine. I'm a junior data scientist from the South African Environmental Observation Network, and I'll be the program moderator for this session. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this important webinar, convened at a time when impacts of climate change are intensifying across the globe. More than ever before, the urgency of accessible, reliable, and interoperable climate data has come to the forefront. Our ability to design effective mitigation and adaptation strategies depends not only on the quality of data, but also on our willingness to share it openly across disciplines, sectors, and national borders. Today's discussions brings together voices from academia, research communities, and policy spaces, particularly within the G20 and Global South. Our speakers today include representatives from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, South African Environmental Observation Network, Human Sciences Research Council, the Global Change Institute, the Academy of Science of South Africa, and the University of Pretoria. Together, we will explore how research institutions can play a leading role in advancing the open climate agenda. We will reflect on how indigenous knowledge systems are being integrated into the climate data systems, the policy frameworks enabling this shift, and the opportunity for scientific communities to bridge the gap between policy and practice. South Africa's contributions and challenges will be central to today's discussions as well, with insights drawn from the work of ASSAf, SAEON, and the National Climate Change Information Systems. We will also place these efforts in the global context, aligning them with initiatives such as the G20 Environmental and Climate Sustainability Working Group and the Initiative of International Cooperation in Open Science, launched at the 2024 G20 Summit. To help unpack these themes, we'll hear from our speakers, who will each share their perspective and experiences in short presentations. Each of our speakers will be given 10 minutes for their presentations. Please note that questions will not be taken immediately afterwards. However, we have set aside a dedicated time for a question and answer session later in the program. I encourage our participants to jot down your questions, whether be in the chat or on a piece of paper, and share them openly during the Q&A session. As our time together, colleagues, is very limited, I kindly ask that all our speakers keep to the time slots to allow space for discussion and reflection. Please note that there has been a change of speakers in the program, as Ms. Mikateko Sithole from the DFFE will not be able to join us. However, she has requested that Ms. Delani Mathevula represent her today. So, to all our participants and to the panelists, I'd like to say thank you once again for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar. With that being said, I'd like to hand over to our organizers, Ms. Nicole du Plessis and Ms. Susan Veldsman. Ms. Nicole is a project coordinator and science communicator at the South African Environmental Observation Network, Egagasini node, as well as an Ocean 20 representative. She will provide the opening remarks on behalf of SAEON and O20. Following her welcome, Ms. Susan Veldsman, who leads the ASSAf Scholarly Publishing Program and S20, and an S20 representative, will deliver opening remarks on behalf of ASSAf as well as S20. With that being said, Nicole, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Galaletsang. Good morning, colleagues and distinguished participants. And potentially, if we have international visitors, good afternoon and good evening. It's a great privilege to join you today on behalf of Ocean 20, alongside our partners in Science 20, to open this important conversation on advancing data sharing for climate action. Ocean 20, as one of the official G20 engagement initiatives, has from the outset placed strong emphasis on connecting global dialogue to real measurable ocean actions. Under South Africa's G20 presidency in 2025, we have a unique opportunity to demonstrate how science and open data can shape a sustainable and inclusive future. The decisions and discussions we advance this year will have resonance well beyond the G20, offering pathways for countries of the Global South and across the world to benefit from equitable access to science and technology. Our shared ocean is both a source of immense opportunity and an area of urgent vulnerability. Rising temperatures, shifting currents, acidification, and biodiversity loss all remind us that without reliable, accessible, and interoperable data, we risk falling behind in both mitigation and adaptation efforts. That is why today's discussion is so vital. By bringing together different perspectives, we can bridge the gap between data and decision-making. Within Ocean 20, we strongly believe that the blue economy and climate resilience must be grounded in evidence that is open, inclusive, and trusted. For us, this means two things. First, ensuring that data flows as freely as the currents of the ocean itself, across disciplines, across borders, and across generations. Second, ensuring that the use of data reflects the lived realities of people, especially in the Global South, where climate impacts are often most severe, but where innovation and knowledge are also abundant. South Africa continues to show leadership in aligning open science, climate data, and regional cooperation. Today's webinar aims to showcase these efforts. Today's discussion will spotlight the G20's presidency's ambition of equality, solidarity, and sustainability. And as Ocean 20 South Africa, we want to ensure that we become a lasting platform that links knowledge to action and action to impact. As we look ahead, let us use this opportunity not only to discuss challenges of governance, infrastructure, and standards, but to actively shape pathways for collaboration. Let this be a step towards a global data ecosystem that empowers nations, protects communities, and sustains our shared ocean and climate future. On behalf of Ocean 20, I wish us fruitful discussions, and I look forward to the ideas and solutions that will emerge here today. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody, participants, our partners in today's event, colleagues, speakers, and other participants. And I just see in the chat box people greeting us from far and wide, really globally. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. So on behalf of the Executive Officer of the Academy of Science of South Africa, ASSAf, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on open climate, advancing accessible, reliable, and interoperable climate data. Thank you very much for my colleague from SAEON, who has really coined and that has profiled this particular webinar in a very apt way. Thank you very much for that. So as we all know, the urgency of the climate crisis becomes more pressing with each passing season. So extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, and increasing social and economic challenges remind us daily that climate change is not a distant threat, but a present reality. So to respond effectively, we need strong evidence-based strategies for both mitigation and adaptation. At the core of this effort, there's one vital ingredient, namely open, high-quality, and interoperable climate data. So this webinar unites voices from across the G20 and beyond to reflect on how academia and research communities can play a leading role in shaping the open climate agenda. We are especially proud to showcase South Africa's contributions through the work of ASSAf by hosting the S20, the South African Environmental Observation Network, responsible for the O20, the Oceans 20, and the National Climate Change Information Systems. These initiatives are building vital infrastructure and partnerships to enhance our collective climate response. Moreover, our dialogue today aligns with international efforts. These collaborations demonstrate the power of global cooperation in advancing open science and specifically open climate data. I hope today's discussion will not only highlight the challenges we face, but also identify the actionable pathways for scientific communities to bridge the gap between policy and practice and to lead efforts in strengthening open data governance. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us today, and I wish all the speakers and our chair a productive and inspiring session. And I would just like to very briefly introduce our Our program director for the day, who is Galaletsang Keebine. She's a junior data scientist at the South African Environmental Observation Network under the National Research Foundation. Her work focuses on transforming data into meaningful insights and decision-ready products. She specializes in analyzing diverse data sets to support evidence-based decision-making and effectively communicating risk and vulnerability. Thank you very much, Galaletsang. We really appreciate your input this morning, and a big thank you to all our collaborators to this webinar and to our speakers. Looking forward to the discussions taking place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for welcoming me, Suzanne, and thank you for welcoming the entire participants on the call, both to you, Nicole, and Suzanne. So we are doing good on time so far. We are about to begin with our first presentation. As stated in the welcoming, each of our presenters will be given 10 minutes for their presentation. So in the interest of time, I'll share only a short introduction for each of our speakers, but our participants can find their full bios in the program for your perusal. Our first speaker will be Ms. Delani Mathevula from the Climate Change Monitoring and Evaluation Directorate from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. Their directorate plays a key role in tracking South Africa's just transition towards climate resilient society. Ms. Delani will be presenting on behalf of Ms. Mikateko, who was unfortunately unable to join us today. So, Ms. Delani, could you kindly share your presentation?
Thank you so much, Chair. My name is Delani Mathevula, standing in for my director. I'm the Deputy Director in the branch Climate Change at Department Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. We deal with the monitoring and evaluation of climate change impacts that are experienced in the country and also the climate change adaptation actions that are implemented. However, today my presentation will also touch base on the mitigation aspect of our work at DFFE with regards to the National Climate Change Information System that I'll be presenting about. I'll take you through the introduction of the National Climate Change Information System, the policy mandate that informed the development of the National Climate Change Information System, how the public and other imported or the key organization can access the information in the National Climate Change Information System. In short, we call it NCCIS. The beneficiaries of the NCCIS and also the development and improvement activities that we are doing that led also to the development of the provincial subsystems. We are used to Teams. How do I remove the names on the side so that I can see my whole slides? If you can assist, Galaletsang.
The chat, there should be an X on top of the pop-up. You can kindly just press them. If it's the chat you're referring to.
Yes. My goodness. Okay, yeah, it's gone.
Okay, thank you.
So just to introduce the National Climate Change Information System, it was developed through our partnership with SAEON, which is still ongoing. So SAEON and DFFE developed a set of decision support tools that was aimed at tracking South Africa's transition towards a low and a climate resilient economy. That tracking tools, the support tracking tools were embedded in the NCCIS. The main focus of these tools or the main focus of this system is to track the adaptation and monitor the reporting platforms of these adaptation actions and mitigation actions to inform the policies and decisions that are made in South Africa. The system forms the integral part of South Africa's broader monitoring, reporting, and verification architecture that supports the transparency under the Paris Agreement and also feeds into several national and subnational frameworks that allows for the reporting platforms. The NCCIS was developed through the mandate of several policies, that is the NDP, what used to inform the mandate of the climate change in South Africa. We used to call it the NCCRP, the National Adaptation Strategy, as well as the Paris Agreement. Now we have the Climate Change Act, which calls for having a mandatory framework that will allow us to track the transition towards a climate resilient economy and also assist us to report in various reporting platforms. The NCCIS or DFFE has developed this comprehensive integrated NCCIS that we also refer to it as a National Monitoring and Evaluation National Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, or the system. It is a web-based platform that allows us to track the progress towards responding to the effects of climate change. The overarching objective of this system, or the monitoring and evaluation system, is to track the transition towards a low carbon economy, climate resilient South Africa, thereby providing evidence-based information to inform effective climate change responses. When it comes to low carbon economy, this is where we talk about tracking the reduction of greenhouse gases and also the related trends, and also tracking the implemented mitigation actions and how effective they are, or we're just doing business as usual. When it comes to the adaptation component of the NCCIS, this is where we track the impacts that are experienced in the country, in all the provinces and their local municipalities, and also to check the adaptation responses that are implemented. How well is South Africa reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity? So all this information is housed in the NCCIS. We also track the finance and the communication part of it. This is the design. So now I'm going to take you through the design of the NCCIS. It has got different components in it. We've got the monitoring component. We also have the evaluation component. The monitoring component comprises of the data and information provision. This is where we engage with various stakeholders to provide this data, and we also collect that data and store it in the this web-based platform. I will take you through the database that we store this climate-related information on. The evaluation component deals with monitoring and evaluating the resilience of these programs and projects that are implemented around the country, and also the finance support that we receive from our South African government, and also the international donor multilateral organization, and how well are we reducing the greenhouse gases in the country. These are guided by a set of indicators, and we do use this information for several use cases, which is part of these outputs, where it feeds into the annual reporting platforms, it feeds into the UNFCCC reporting obligations and other reporting platforms. So this is how our systems looks like. This part here is the landing page. It tells you about what the NCCIS is all about. The component here is the National Climate Change Response Database, where we store the collected climate change projects and programs from our provinces. And we do have other tools within the NCCIS that looks at different things. For example, we do have the National Framework for Climate Services. We also have the South African Carbon Sink Atlas. There is a lot of sub-tools within the National Climate Change Information System. Now I'll take you through the National Climate Change Response Database. The database is the platform where we collect climate change adaptation and also mitigation, as well as the climate finance information, and stores it in this database. Currently, we have 446 adaptation projects. We also have 485 South African mitigation projects, and we have 3 cross-cutting projects. The NCCRD was developed in relation to the disasters that are expected to happen or that are currently happening in South Africa. We needed to know what is happening where and how our communities are experiencing the impacts of climate change. Therefore, the NCCRD is intended to be a resource for anyone working on climate change, adaptation and mitigation component in South Africa regarding the past, current, and future climate change response efforts. This looks at policies, plans, strategies, projects, and research. The NCCRD was developed in 2008 in collaboration with SAEON. This was in response to the implementation of the NDP Vision 2030. The NCCRD was designed to capture and store details of climate change interventions, including adaptation and mitigation and cross-cutting. I won't say much because I already said a lot in my past presentation, in my past slides. However, before the Climate Change Act that was implemented last year in July, the submission of this information was voluntary because we did not have any legal mandate that allowed us to source this information from our provinces. So data collections was a challenge prior to the act, and we are hoping everything will be different now that we have a legal mandate to not to enforce, but to ensure that provinces submit these climate change projects to us. The purpose of the NCCRD was to monitor the success of the responses to climate change, also to support government in tracking how well they are doing in response to climate change, and also to support or assist government to meet their international reporting obligations, and also generally to collect and store information into this NCCIS and the response database, to also measure the climate change cost, outcome, and the impacts. This is how our response database looks like. I see the time is going. The current progress and institutional context, we are currently having the improvement processes that are going on. And part of it is that we are now developing the provincial climate change information system to enable us or to enable the provinces to have ownership into this climate change information system. We have currently developed the system for Mpumalanga, and we have concluded the system for Free State. I'll skip that one. This is how the Mpumalanga Climate Change Information System looks like. And they also have their own database, which DFFE or at the national level, we're able to sync and extract data that we use in different platforms. This is how the Free State Climate Change Information Systems looks like. The beneficiaries of these systems are the policymakers, the government departments, academia, for them to look at the possible areas where they can tap into and develop tools and research areas, your civil societies, the private sectors to identify the investment areas, as well as UNFCCC to use this information for their different reporting mandates. Also, in terms of it being an open data or aligning to the open data principle, NCCIS is a public tool that allows for downloading the raw data, regardless of who you are in South Africa, as long as you are a key actor in responding to climate change. It also allows for a user-friendly interface that allows for searching and downloading visualization of the information that we are looking for. It also set a clear update cycles, more especially when it comes to the mitigation side of things, but adaptation, we are still lagging behind. It also aligns with the IPCC guidelines and also the UNFCCC reporting standards. We also engage with stakeholders for consultations, and also they promote the use of data that is housed in the NCCIS and the NCCRD. So I don't know, I was rushing looking at the time, but at the moment we are still looking for funding. Galaletsang, you will stop me when my 10 minutes is over. At the moment we are still looking for funding.
Delani,
Hi, Galaletsang.
it is actually over the 10 minutes. You are now going into the 12 minutes. So can you wrap it up?
Okay, no, it's okay. At the moment, we are currently looking for funding to further develop provincial subsystems that will allow for ownership and also for provinces to zoom into what is currently happening in their provinces, unlike when we are looking at the NCCIS, which is only looking at the national level. So this is to promote the ownership and for them to allow us to receive the data that we use for different types of use cases. So I think I will end there, Galaletsang. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Delani. In interest of time, I'll be moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker was supposed to be Dr. Wilfred Yanga, but unfortunately he has an urgent meeting he needs to attend to. So I asked our participants and our speakers to kindly bear with us, and we're just gonna move everybody one slot above on the program. So our next speaker will be Professor Coleen Vogel, a climatologist by training and a distinguished professor at the Global Change Institute of the University of the Witwatersrand. While rooted in climatology, her work has increasingly focused on social dimensions of climate change, with particular emphasis on climate change adaptation.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to share, and I'll try and take you through as much as I can in the short time. I want to shift the focus a little bit. We've heard a lot about data and how we collect data, but I really want to try and shift the orientation outwards towards society and what we can all do. So we've talked about, what government is doing, and it's wonderful to hear, and congratulations, we now have an act. But who is in the room when we're making up these policies? So in terms of my presentation, I'd like to root us into the SDGs. That map often reminds me of Find Wally. Where's Wally? It's a lot of arrows and interconnections. How do we make sense of these processes? Climate change, as you've heard from our introductory speakers, is particularly for Southern Africa where we live. The region is a hotspot. We're warming at the rate that is twice the rate of the global rate of warming. We've got El Niños and La Niñas that interfere with our livelihoods and daily lives. But we can expect, according to the modeling so far, heat waves of unprecedented intensity and also then buffeted by extreme storms as we go along in terms of climate variability. So we are really in a hotspot and we need to muster all the resources we can. But what I want to try and turn our attention to is to not only looking at quantitative data, obviously that's very important, but also how do we get social voices and also indigenous and local and tacit knowledge data into these systems so that we are capturing the real heart, if you like, of some of the issues. So context matters in the rural context as well as in the urban context. This is very close. It's a bit of an old picture, but the issues are still the same. Of Alex, if those of you who fly into Johannesburg near OR Tambo, these are the services issues and constraints where infrastructure and maintenance is not keeping up with the histories and the legacies, but also the current governance systems that we have in the country. So what then happens when you have a climate event is the intersectionality of an extreme event, for example, or a heavy downpour. This was a flash flood that occurred many years ago, a couple of years ago, sorry, but it intersected with drains that were blocked, with systems that weren't operational, etc., etc. And so you had quite a large flood. And unfortunately, this is being repeated now in one of our provinces in particular, but also in other provinces. And here we had a massive flood, again, that intersected with land use planning decisions that we've made, placing people in marginal areas. And it was a huge loss. And we keep on having these losses, which I would argue is now rolling back some of our development progress and is particularly pertinent, I think, for not only the G20, but also our own government as we move forward. So it's not only monetary cost, but the cost of lives that we need to be thinking about. So what can we do? And what kind of data should we be actually collecting? And one of the things that I keep promoting is to do what is called science working together with society. Not us as scientists only tracking data from satellites and very complicated models, but also going out and working with society, finding out with civic organizations, traditional leaders who we'll hear more about from later with indigenous knowledge systems, but opening up those societal spaces so that we can really collect data, which we can find ways now with great, different systems approaches in data capturing, how we can then translate and pull that into the policy with the Climate Act. So I'm just going to give you one quick example, local climate story, if you like, a global meeting with a local situation. This is work that we've been doing with the city of Johannesburg. We helped them with their climate adaptation planning. We worked in the city. We're still working with the city, trying to make sense of the decision-making systems that we heard about earlier. Where is that data coming from all the sectors in the city who are under huge constraints, not least governance, but also a number of other challenges? How can we surface and help the city working with our very complicated and excellent data that we bring, for example, from the Global Change Institute, but pulling through other data as well? And here are some of the issues that I think are quite interesting that came out of the city when we did research a couple of months ago, and in fact in the past. They argued that climate change is an elitist discourse. So how do we make it local? There's no long-term vision. Now we've got an act. Who will come in? We've got silos. We've got KPAs or KPIs that aren't aligned to the act. So how are we going to get that data into this platform that has just recently been presented on this webinar? So it also needs to be championed, and you can see the issue of the KPAs or the KPIs are critical. If that isn't aligned into the act, I don't think we're going to be capturing the kind of data that we need. For example, we've just done a study, a colleague of mine who now is working with a student actually, now working in the World Bank, working heavily on early warning systems with the city and the country on early warning capacity. You'll see the kinds of issues. There's a lot of problems with resource capacity when he looked at the different municipalities, Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni. There are reactive and not proactive responses. There's a lack of knowledge. There's siloing. People don't know other departments, etc. So how do we get to that data? That's what I'd like to leave you with. So the policy implementation gap may end up, I hope not, just being a document on paper without really looking at the interdepartmental coordination and the drilling down into where it really matters. So how can we create a future story? And I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I would argue we're not thinking creatively enough. We need to be opening up new spaces and what we call agoras for action. We need to be waking up and looking at new ways of seeing and being, not being blinked at only by our traditional, if you like, positivist science approach. The arts, the creatives, the culture, the local, traditional, and other knowledges, and then young science change agents that we need to be bringing in, as well as the elders. I've been doing a lot of work on this with the city and with youth engagement throughout the country. We've got a youth climate action plan that was also generated. This is feeding in. The youth are very active. They've got new ways of collecting data. They've got TikTok. They've got all these kinds of things. We need to be looking creatively at those and working in partnership in a carefully monitored and validated way so that the information collected is not only sterile, but also is active. And as you can see here, the youth were very fortunate to be invited into actually writing into the climate action plan in the city by a mayor of the time. So they've already got their mark. They're not just tokenistic representatives in the city system. So as I end, I argue that what I'm wanting to leave you with is that we need to expand our vision. We're thinking very traditionally, I think, which is good. We need to keep on building up our climate science, collecting good and robust data, especially now where there might be blockages from various groups and geopolitical entities to prevent us getting data. But we also need to be exploring these rich inner spaces, culture, art, religion, spirituality. What data can we source from these people and communities and entities that have rich data sources but might not be plugged into the system? So I'll just give you one quick example. I'm very privileged to work with Hanali Kutsia, an ex-student of mine, who's currently working with the city of Johannesburg in a project called SOMISANA. It's funded. They're working with over nearly 3,000 Alexander water warriors who are keen. They're wanting to get jobs. So these are communities working right there in the city, not only collecting data in, if you like, the traditional way. Let me just give you a quick vision of that. They've got various activities along the Alexandra and in the Yixke River area. And you can actually see the kind of waste recycling, biodiversity. You've got the park that they're trying to create, entities for communities to get more buy-in, not to feel removed, to come in and join these types of efforts that we're talking about in today's webinar. So just some examples. This is all from recyclable work and refuse and plastics, etc., that have come out of the river. So I think we need to be careful, not only talking oceans, but also talking a lot about the biodiversity and nature-based solutions that the rivers in our cities, that if they get choked, become not only an adaptation liability, but also other sources of stress. So finally, in conclusion, I'd like to ask us as a scientific community, but also in the policy and practice community, to please remember that data is not only hardware. I think we all get buffeted by AI. We all become a bit fearful in a way. We're driven by this technology. It's fantastic. We should not be driven by that. But we also need to keep an eye on the software. What do the arts offer us in terms of data? What is social media? Young people with their energies, with their web-based interactive capability. But then more importantly, if we don't have the hardware, if we don't have that long-term collective buy-in, I don't think we'll get very far. So with that, I'd like to just acknowledge all the wonderful people that I work with who've been trying to help us get a better handle on data and what it might mean looking at it with different eyes around data. Thank you so much for the chance to present. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Yanga Malotana, a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria and an energy policy and climate change analyst. She also serves as a project manager and communications lead for Emerging Scholars Initiative and as an external stakeholders coordinator for early career professionals within the Indian Ocean Rim Association Academic Group of South Africa. Thank you. Ms. Yanga, over to you.
Thank you so much again, Chair, for that. And I would like to say good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for having me here. Very honored to be engaging on this platform, and particularly with the topic that I have been given, which is to kind of engage with the nexus between Indigenous knowledge, community engagement, and climate resilience. And I think my presentation flows in quite nicely based off what Prof. Vogel has just presented. And just for context in terms of my presentation in and of itself, I am a sustainability scholar, and being a sustainability scholar, I apply sustainability in almost any kind of metrics that we engage with. So whether that is in a data perspective, energy systems perspective, or in this case, us engaging with Indigenous knowledge, community engagement, and climate resilience. And in order to understand where my presentation is going to go and perhaps the direction that it's aiming to engage with, we have to understand the nexus of sustainability and essentially what sustainability comes down to. And the idea of sustainability is that there's the intersection of economic, social, and ecological premises coming together in a way that is viable, bearable, and equitable. And in an environment in which they can all come together, then life is protected, the environment is protected, and the earth is protected, right? And with us not necessarily getting this balance quite well, then there's going to be gaps in society in terms of how we face particular problems, and in certain situations, the challenges of integrating Indigenous knowledge systems in terms of sciences, in terms of how we engage in policy, in terms of how we engage in economics, right? And so then if we were to look at it in terms of Indigenous knowledge and community engagement and climate resilience, if we would like to place sustainability at the nexus, all of those economic, environmental, and social factors kind of have to come into play and be considered well in terms of how we were to prioritize Indigenous knowledge systems, right? And how that could potentially lie in is that understanding that the intersection produces knowledge systems that have sustained communities, for millennia, and governance models that would have to be inclusive, governance models that have to be equitable in decision-making, and also understanding that there would need to be adaptation strategies that are able to build resilience while regenerating ecosystems. And then, of course, economic models that are able to create prosperity without exploitation, which is the ideal that we would obviously like to have, right? That being said, If we were to look at the nexus in action in South Africa, because it's not something that is particularly new, it's not something that is suggested out of thin air. We know that we've seen the sustainable agriculture nexus, for example, in the Vembe district in the Limpopo River Valley, where there's traditional crop rotations, community water management, and indigenous soil fertility in terms of how the indigenous communities engage with the plants. And there's a exchange of information that happens with the scientific communities, the farming communities, in terms of how that sustainability were to work. And we know that the result of that most of the time is us getting traditional soil classification plus crop rotation systems, which is that integration of indigenous knowledge, understanding that the community engagement aspect of it is very Ubuntu-based, where there's cooperative farming structures, and then also the climate resilience aspect of it, using the indigenous knowledge to go through drought-resistant varieties and water harvesting. And usually, more often than not, the sustainability outcome of what happens in that particular case study is that it yields 40% higher, and there's a 60% lower input cost and improved soil health, and essentially the communities in and of themselves become stronger, right? So we know there's a benefit to this in the first place. Then in the Eastern Cape, if we were to go to renewable energy, nexus in terms of how the indigenous architecture would engage with people, community governance, resource management, and the different examples that we've seen with water energy nexus, it is still an application of the pursuit of the sustainability and us wanting to have that viability between the three metrics, right? Where you want to have traditional building and orientation in order to have those passive cooling techniques. You have the community engagement where community ownership models are based on traditional governance. The climate resilience comes through from the microgrids and traditional weather prediction for energy management. And the sustainability outcome, of course, from that is that there's energy access, local economic development, and carbon reduction. And if we were to go to a third case study in the Western Cape with the urban water nexus, which came out from the drought and the day zero that the Western Cape had, there's different initiatives that have happened in different parts of the Western Cape, in Khayelitsha, in Mitchell's Plain, as you can see over there in the presentation. But at the key of it is also realizing that 4 points are still being hit with it, that there's the integration of the indigenous knowledge where traditional rainwater harvesting is brought together with groundwater management, where then you've got community engagement ticked off with neighborhood water cooperatives and climate resilience dealt with drought proofing and flood management. And the sustainability outcome, or at least the aim for it, is having water security and community empowerment and ecosystem restoration. And so then, of course, when it comes to the case of economics for sustainability as well, it comes down to 4 things. It comes down whether or not it's cost effective, whether or not you can make money out of it, so the revenue generation, if there's a risk deduction, and of course, if there's an innovation premium. And that's what's so unique about traditional knowledge as well, is that if it's integrated into modern technology, it can create, competitive advantages. We think of social returns, particularly when it comes to capacity building, cultural preservation, social cohesion, and intergenerational equity, right? And then, we have environmental returns, because then we have carbon sequestration, biodiversity enhancement, ecosystem services, and the regenerative impact that comes with it. And if we then look at it in terms of the other nexus, so now we've dealt with the social nexus, we've now dealt with the economic nexus. If we're looking at it in terms of the governance nexus, which falls under social nexus, apologies, at the core of it, and perhaps what we would be applying, is the principle of Ubuntu, right? The idea of we're going to be helping each other as a community. That is the whole point of knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems integrating with traditional Western structures that collect data, for example. And part of that is, when that principle is applied, it promotes consensus building, it promotes intergenerational thinking, and there's reciprocation of many things. The same way that modern institutional applications allow for participatory budgeting, where it's not just the traditional trajectory in the way that we've understood it, co-management structures, adaptive management, and there's a benefit sharing that also kind of comes out of it. Conflict resolution that comes with the idea of you're working with people, so that affects how we understand mediation, how we understand justice, whether it's restorative, environmental, or knowledge justice, right? And then when it comes to the economic indicators themselves, then we would need to have different multipliers, us understanding the diversification index, the resource efficiency ratio, innovation coefficient, etc., right? The indicators of the success of the sustainability would depend on how we were to define these economic indicators, and in this case, the social indicators, and then also the environmental indicators. You forgive me, I'm going a little bit faster because of time constraints, but I'm happy to come back to this if you guys would like in the discussion itself. But the thing I really want to hone into over here, as I'm going to go into a wrap up, is that we need to be honest about how it's possible that something like sustainability, that sounds incredible and an incredible initiative that we want to have, and within sustainability is perhaps the most inclusive metric that we have got in terms of how it includes Indigenous communities, and yet it feels like there are very specific barriers that stop us from actually getting there. And we know exactly why those barriers exist. They exist because we live in uncomfortable realities. The powers that be don't necessarily want to share, right? Knowledge colonialism is a real thing. Communities in and of themselves are also not homogeneous, and traditional knowledge is being actively lost as we are going through this crisis. There's systemic barriers and systemic structural barriers that we have to understand. Finance systems demand quick returns, right? And government changes, right? There's priority shifts, there's electoral changes, academic incentives reward publications and not necessarily community outcomes. And the global supply chains, quite frankly, just do not value sustainability unless it is within the framework of it being cheaper, exploitative, and alternatives that undercut the kind of nexus in the global markets in and of themselves. And just to go through with it, of course, then there's like cultural, social challenges, etc. The money problem in and of itself, technical barriers that also exist, political, economic barriers, but it essentially comes down to four things as I'm wrapping up, Chair, is that there's an issue with cognitive colonialism where we've internalized the belief that Western systems are modern and therefore better and therefore more efficient. There's the issue of risk aversion, which is why there's a difficulty of translating Indigenous knowledge systems into economic systems where institutions choose familiar failure over unfamiliar success. There's a measurement bias where we can only count what economists can actually quantify. And of course, then the time mismatch. There's a balancing of electoral cycles, ecological cycles, and community building cycles, right? And so then what are the actual solutions if you're going to go through this very quickly? If we were to apply an integrated approach with it, we would have to start with what works, right? And which is what you can see over there in my left-hand corner, where we have the pragmatic allies, the economic value first, using existing power and scaling success, moving down to working within the financial reality in which we existed, right? Because that's the system that we are trying to put in these Indigenous knowledge systems. Moving over to addressing powers directly, and then, of course, navigating cultural complexity. And in the way that these are integrated approaches, then perhaps a systems change in the challenge that Prof. Vogel had kind of given us on what can we actually do. These are the different areas, I would argue, that we can try to contribute to, right? And as I'm 1 minute over, I'm happy to say that I'll be right here during the whole entire discussion. Happy to connect. Those are my details over there. And if there's any particular questions you'd like to ask, feel free to ask them to me at the Q&A session. Thank you so much, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you for that presentation, Yanga, and thank you for trying to stick to the time. So our next speaker is Mr. Leo Chiloane, Manager of the Ulwazi Node at the South African Environmental Observation Network. He also serves as a co-chair of the In Situ Data subgroup within the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observations, Data and Knowledge Working Group. Mr. Leo?
Good morning, all. So I'm just going to shift the focus from data itself, but shift it to its governance and its management. I have tried to condense my slides as much as possible in the interest of time, but I'm happy to engage in the Q&A if any of the points raised need elaborate discussion. So looking at data sharing from a global change perspective, I think we run into big challenges when it comes to the number of disciplines that we have to work with within that space. So as a data manager, what we're often faced, even in my context at the South African Environmental Observation Network, is that the wide range of disciplines have different data acquisition activities themselves. And then this creates a highly heterogeneous data landscape because one of the things that's often required is to integrate data sets from all of these. So the efforts to create and adopt standards become limited, creating a fragmented approach to data management with significant gaps in some areas. And then the second issue that we often deal with, I know data is often presented from a big data perspective, but when you're working with climate data, certainly in the case of in situ data in particular, we have to work with very small data sets that are very heterogeneous, as I've highlighted in the previous slide, but they exist in greater varieties and larger quantities. So issues of harmonization become problematic. So what we often find is that when people work with big data, so like remote sensing models and so on, that's often uniform and easier to standardize and manage, although it does require high performance computing resources and large volumes of storage. But when it comes to the smaller data sets, the integration issues become more prominent. And then when it comes to historic data as well, in the context of individual researchers, what we often find is that they work with data in their individual capacity, publish papers from that, and most of those data sets used in scientific literature are never published formally, so they become lost over time. And what approaches have tried to address this issue is like working through federated data systems that integrate data from disparate sources, to try and come up with frameworks for managing these. Generally speaking, if you're looking at the management of data, in the case of climate data, I'd say you would deal with three broad principles. Those working with research data are mostly familiar with FAIR. So FAIR addresses the data itself. So, and in terms of FAIR, what the principles look at is around its management and accessibility in online system, as well as those systems being interoperable with multiple infrastructures. But beyond that, there's also there are also trust principles. So these apply to the infrastructures or repositories managing these data sets. And the metrics for that usually measure sustainability of those infrastructures to manage data over time, and the transparency in applying data governance processes. So the policies and knowing who the designated communities of those data are is important, as well as the technology used. But this is typically measured through certification, formal certification of infrastructures. I'll touch on it a bit later. And then lastly, when you're dealing with indigenous data governance, there are care principles that highlight certain areas of responsibility that have to be taken into account when dealing with those communities. So all in all, these three broad principles, with FAIR addressing data sharing, trust addressing infrastructure sustainability, and care addressing indigenous data governance. All in all, they are meant as best practices for proper data management. So the guidelines, what we find is that they're very elaborate and well documented, but often the challenge is the collaboration between researchers producing the data and data stewards that becomes an impediment to implementation of these. And in the context of open data, I mean, there are all kinds of talks about making data open, but what we often find is that a point that's often emphasized is the role of licenses. So licenses do facilitate the proper sharing and reuse of data, and it is actually better to apply data licenses in addition to organizational policies and so on, because they facilitate sharing across infrastructures, as well as providing clear attribution guidelines for the data. So what we often find is that custom data policies are great, especially if they're open, but they're not machine actionable. So if I'm sharing data from one infrastructure to the next, my organizational policy is not going to translate into that infrastructure. So it's good practice to use licenses in this regard. And then data users themselves need to understand their legal rights and obligations, as well as the data producers would like to be attributed properly. And licenses do offer some guidelines on this. While data may be described as open, so in the case of data policies, it doesn't provide sufficient legal clarity because it usually applies to the organization that's written up the policy. So you have those issues of diverse policies to deal with if licenses are not clearly stated. So as much as possible, licenses should be open and avoid unnecessary restrictions. Of course, the exceptions would be in cases where data are sensitive, or in cases where you're dealing with the private sector and they have to generate income from those. So context issues can be addressed as well. But good examples of licenses include Creative Commons, Open Data Commons, etc. But one thing that they also enable is to aggregate data from different sources, because one of the challenges is when you're dealing with data streams with different data policies or different data licenses, and we are creating an aggregated data product, you should use the most restrictive license from your input data sources to license that product at minimum. So I think opening it up as broadly as possible also alleviates this problem to some extent. So this is just an example of our approach at SAEON to managing data from linking from multiple services or systems. So we have created a model or an infrastructure that links systems via metadata services. And primarily, these are run through shared services that include authentication of access to those different systems, taking into account institutional data policies and such, and access control of the data. And then there's the long-term preservation of the data itself in trusted repositories. And then there's publication of that data in accessible platforms where users can download the data sets. And then in the context of dealing with heterogeneous data, what we often find is that harmonization is also a challenge. So we work with several vocabulary brokering services to try and harmonize at least data from different disciplines. And then lastly, looking at interoperability and integration of systems. So these are typically applied through use cases from different data archives that we manage, either internal to SAEON. I'm not going to go into elaborate examples of each in the interest of time, but for example, the National Climate Change Response Database was presented earlier in this webinar, but these address different data streams for both internally managed systems and external systems. But these are then realized through dissemination portals. So we have several, we support different portals for the dissemination of information, including our core data portal, a marine information management system that we also develop with the DFFE. And then for best practice, we also offer services for minting DOI so that data can be formally cited in publications. But we also recognize that working in silos often doesn't really address the problem of efficient data use when users have to download data from different systems. So wherever possible, we do try to scale these to global levels by feeding the data into internationally recognized global data aggregators. So in the context of marine data, yes.
Your time is up. You've now heading on to 13 minutes.
All right. So I'm finishing up, I'm wrapping up. So we integrate with the Ocean Data Information System and the Group on Earth Observation System of Systems. Using a range of technologies, we offer these services. And then just in summary, to close off, so best practices do require a range of actors, including data producers, researchers, and then availability of appropriate frameworks through standards and federated infrastructures, use of certified repositories and sustainability to ensure sustainability and resilience, and then engaging with communities at different levels to develop fit for purpose models, and then using maturity models where applicable.
So thank you. I am involved in a lot of the WMO activities. I'm the vice chair of their research board. And we have a global task force on looking at the sharing of climate and hydrological data. So we've been putting that together, and I can talk a lot more on that, but I wanted you to be aware of that particular task force that falls under the WMO. But the question I would like to ask is, I'm sure you are all aware that many of the big global databases that are managed or funded by American funding will be closed down at the end of this year, and we will no longer have access to long-term, particularly climate data. So could I ask, and whoever's prepared to answer it, what strategy have you put in place to deal with that?
That's a very good question. Is there any one of our panelists who'd like to respond? Thank you, Leo.
I can respond from an Earth observations data point of view. So what we do in our context, certainly in the context of the Group on Earth Observations, which is an intergovernmental organization, I think working with different governments to mobilize the data actually helps when some some countries are struggling for a limited period of time. So that helps build up resilience. So I think feeding data into aggregators that are intergovernmental in nature also helps in this regard. But even in the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission's point of view, the point stands, I think. Yeah.
Okay, if I may just continue to make a recommendation. So it has been strongly recommended globally that if you are reliant on data of this nature, and it will no longer be available after December, and no intergovernmental organization will be able to access that data, that you should start downloading and archiving all the particular data sets that you currently use. So I just wanted to put that on the table so that everybody is aware of the rapidly changing nature of data acquisition in our field of climate modeling particularly.
Okay, there's no question. So this question will be from me to anyone on the panel again. So the importance of open and interoperable climate data has been highlighted by the presentations thus far, and it's critical for effective climate action and bridging the gap between policy and practice, particularly in G20 countries. So how do we go about ensuring that these do not only provide knowledge, but are also used for addressing socioeconomic vulnerabilities and inequalities across the G20 countries?
Thanks for the question. I think there's not a one shop fits all, and I think we've got to be careful of that, because I know there's an effort to try and have one place where you go for everything. And I think, Mary's made the point about climate data, there's other data sources. So I think we need to start piggybacking on entities that are already doing work, like the SAEONs, etc. But it would be really interesting to hear more from the monitoring and evaluation group at DFFE, how and what, if that is becoming our kind of nodal point for South Africa, for example, how they are trying to do this. I know we got a bit of that from their presentation, but maybe if I could kind of pass the ball across over to Delani, how is DFFE trying to build up the data platforms from very, the municipalities that we're working with are really, constrained. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have lots of access to all kinds of technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's an excellent question, but maybe Delani can tell us a little bit more of the, I don't want to call it the softer end, but the kind of the practical end of that gathering node that you have in DFFE. Thanks.
So yes, thank you, Galaletsang, Chair. So what we're trying to do, drawing from the NCCIS, which is our monitoring and evaluation framework, the online-based platform. So the collection of that data, the adaptation component of it, we are not only just collecting data for the sake of collecting data so that we have 1,000 projects that are implemented in the country. The main point here is to look at, are we really having that impact in our communities, in our local municipalities? Are we really reducing these vulnerabilities? How many roads have been improved? How many jobs have been created? So we have got a set of indicators that are looking at your social aspect of things, your economic aspect of things, and also the core benefits that looks at the environmental benefits at the end of the implementation of those projects. So the data that we are collecting, we are also checking that are we just ticking the box, or we are reducing the vulnerability and inequalities that are persistent in our country. And talking about the municipalities, that they are really, really constrained, and this is where everything is happening, and they have this data. But we have that is the other reason why we ended up developing these subsystems, because we're not really getting the data of what is implemented on the ground that is responding to climate change. So we are hoping for that change, that with the development of these provincial subsystems, they will somehow enforce the capacity building at the local ground, and also the employment of more climate change champions on the ground, so that we receive this data and start analyzing for this resiliency and building the bridging the gaps of inequalities and employment creation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to see that our data is not only open and available, but it's fair, inclusive, and directly improves the lives of South Africans. So I see that we've managed to get the presentation up. I'd like to thank our participants for being patient with us and for giving us the leeway to sort our technical problems out. Dr. Gustav, over to you.
And I'm here presenting on behalf of SOMISANA. My presentation is titled SOMISANA, Advancing Ocean Modeling in South Africa. And I'm presenting just to basically describe what we do, well, what exactly we do, and yeah, and what we kind of bring to the table. And yeah, so our team, it's small but yet efficient. It consists of Jennifer Veach, Jal Ferron, Laura Braby, Nkululeko Malema, and myself. We're all based in Cape Town at the Egarasini node of SAEON. So yeah, you can, next slide, please. Okay, so it's no surprise that our ocean along the South African continent is vast and dynamic. We have the warm Agulhas current on the east coast and the cold Benguela current on the west coast, both of which supports industries and coastal communities. So to better understand the dynamical environment, we use large global models. As good as these models are, they have issues resolving the finer scale dynamics along the coastline, which are incredibly important for both industry and local communities, which is why we need very reliable, trusted regional models in South Africa. Next slide, please. So SOMISANA, what is it? So SOMISANA, it stands for Sustainable Ocean Modeling Initiative, a South African approach. It's about uniting and developing South African expertise in ocean modeling to provide knowledge on ocean change that is both accurate and reliable. With collaboration at its core, the initiative is meant to bring together different institutes and researchers, both local and international, to share knowledge and expertise. This is that the coastal communities and decision makers, this is so that the coastal, well, the communities and decision makers can be better prepared for the future. Next slide, please. So since large global models are widely and freely available, our small team at SOMISANA cannot necessarily compete against these titans of the industry. So therefore we use the structures that's already developed without reinventing the wheel, and really tailored for our specific use case. Essentially, we develop a system that is geographically relocatable. Next slide, please. So along the west coast, our ocean is nutrient-rich, obviously, and supports a valuable fishing and aquaculture region. However, these industries are susceptible to harmful algal blooms that can greatly impact them. Next slide, please. On the southeast coast, at Algoa Bay, it is located very closely to a very busy shipping lane. There's lots of oil exploration and many bunkering activities. These industries are financially important. However, incidents can and do occur which threatens surrounding ecosystems, such as the very large African penguin colony in Algoa Bay. I should also mention here that none of these ships in the figures were, to my knowledge, at least involved in any oil spills in Algoa Bay. Next slide, please. So we have developed two operational models thus far that are based on these valuable areas. They are named the SA West and the SA Southeast models. So we provide both hindcast and forecast of these domains. The hindcast domains are both useful, are both used for research and development, capacity development, and we provide about 10 to 27 years worth of data that are used by various students all over. So the forecast models, on the other hand, we provide operationally to our stakeholders and the public. We provide a 5-day forecast at an hourly resolution. And then spatially, our models are better in terms of the spatial resolution along the coast compared to the global models. So this is quite important because they are able to resolve the finer scale dynamics that can impact the industries. So the small domains are very light in terms of computation, meaning we do not need massive servers to run them operationally. So you can run any of these models in about 30 minutes or so. We have also developed like a poor man's ensemble, if you might call it, whereby we use various ocean and atmospheric products as the boundary conditions for our models. At the moment, we use GFS and SOARS for atmospheric conditions, and then the Mikateko and HICOM for the ocean conditions. So this also provides different solutions of our two model domains. So when we provide our products to our stakeholders, they are informed about the variance in the results. It also highlights the international and local collaboration that we have developed between different industries or different organizations as well. Next slide, please. So obviously we have to evaluate our models, and just to show that our models are good and reliable, I've just got an example here. In this example, we compare our model temperature to the in situ UTR at Lambert's Bay at the top and then Komiki at the bottom. I also wanted to show that you get different results based on the different wind forcings that we used to run our models, which is obviously important for our ensembles. So in this specific case, we use ERA 5 indicated with the red and WASA indicated with the green. We computed both the in situ in blue and the glories in black. And the reason for including glories is just basically to compare to what we use to force the models. So if we can see that our models are better than glories, then it kind of, it's not all for nothing. Then we computed the correlation of both model runs and compare that to the glories and the in situ measurements. And in addition, we also computed the RMSE, which is the root mean square error, which basically tells us just the average difference between the models and the observations. And just to summarize the results here, you can kind of see that the higher correlation and the lower RMSE values of our models just kind of confirms that our models are better than glories and that we do not just do this for nothing, and that there's something to gain out of all of this. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay, yes. So where can you find all of this data that we have provided? So so both our long-term hindcast and our operational forecast models are available on our website at somisana.ac.za, where we have a thread server. Next slide, please. We also have a Melusi server, and yes, we also, all our tools and everything is available on a GitHub page where we provide instructions from installation, running your own simulation, and visualizing the outputs. Next slide, please. And this is all very well and fine, but we also have value-added tools here, which we provide, which are freely available, and we provide, or we use it to inform our stakeholders. We have implemented an OpenDrift package, which is a Lagrangian particle tracking toolbox, which we can use for oil spill cases, such as the one that you see there at, that occurred just offshore of Strandfontein, as well as search and rescue cases, which I think our biggest collaborator here is really SAMHSA. Anyway, next slide, please. So other tools that we provide is temperature anomalies, and this is actually quite useful for both fishing and aquaculture industries, as well as for recreation when you want to go to the beach and you're curious to know if the water is going to be warm. But yeah, so yeah, that's also quite nice. Next slide, please. And yeah, and then all of these tools and all these value-added products contributes to the national OSIMs, which is the National Ocean and Coastal Information Management System, which basically provides decision support tools for the effective governments of South African oceans and coasts. I've also just listed some of our stakeholders and partners, and I apologize for those that I have not listed there. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's next? Well, we are currently in the process of developing a much larger EEZ model, so it's an exclusive economic zone model, so basically to include the entire coastline of South Africa. But like all good things, it takes time. But yeah, it would be nice to include the entire coastline as opposed to just certain sections as well. Next slide, please. We're also furthering developing our value-added products. I just listed some of the tools that we are wanting to develop and that is sort of like in the process, such as the marine heatwave tracker, upwelling indices, climate indices for long-term trends. Those will obviously be very useful for our stakeholders. Next, and I'm open to your recommendations, please, in the to what you would suggest we implement. Next slide, please. Finally, we're also developing a catalog to have like a central place for all of our products, for everybody to access our products. Yeah, that is available to the public. And also what would be nice is also not just a catalog, but also like a web app so that you can subset your data and everything. But we're also in the process of developing that. And that's all from me. Thanks.
Right on time. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Gustav. So
Sure.
I'm going through the list, and I see that unfortunately our last speaker, Dr. Wilfred Langa, is still not on the call, so I'm guessing that he was unable to return to the session. He unfortunately had to step away for an emergency meeting and will therefore not be presenting today. This is of course unfortunate, but I believe that his presentation will be shared with you after this webinar. I'd like to take this moment to say thank you so much to our speakers for sharing such insightful presentations, but we'd now love to hear from you, our audience. This is our chance to ask questions, share reflections, or draw connections to your own work. So please feel free to raise your hand or raise your questions in the chat, and then just if you raise your hand, I will identify you, and then you can go ahead and unmute yourself and state to which of our speakers your question is directed to. Looking through the chat now, I see there's a hand up from Ina. Okay, Ina. I'm sorry.
This has been a real fruit salad of presentations. And I think when we planned this webinar, it was exactly the idea. We wanted to have a better understanding of what the position of government is in terms of climate data, and also what is happening on the ground and how they align with one another. So maybe a question to each of the panelists, and I know Professor Vogel is in quite a rush. I don't know if she's still available, but we addressed the policy of the systems in place by government, the DFFE. We talked about science engagement and climate data. We talked about indigenous knowledge and also more on a technical level, ocean data. So my question to these presenters is, what is it you need from government? What is not working currently? What's working and what's not working? And how can we better align with one another from the different sectors? Or is it not needed? I think we're all part of one big ecosystem, so it's important that we align and harmonize. So please, if I may ask each of the presenters that question.
Cool. I'll identify our speakers one by one. So let's start over with Yanga. Would you like to take the baton on that one?
Sure. It's a bit of an existential question, that, isn't it? What is needed, and I'm not going to direct it necessarily to a specific sector or to say this is what the government needs to do or this is what the private sector needs to do, etc. I think at the core of it, and something that I think we all believe and we understand, is that climate change in and of itself is not something that can have linear approaches towards it. It requires integrated and systemic approaches. And not to sound like a broken record, but it is true. We work a lot of times in silos. And from conversations that I've heard in particular, with the scientific community, I really do not mean to push. I mean, I had someone in an event that I was attending, and they were just like, well, yeah, we give you the data and we go back into our underground caves to collect the data, and we just pop it out, and then you guys can do whatever you want with it. And unfortunately, that's just not how the climate response is supposed to work, firstly. And so that's the first solution to it, is that understanding that it cannot work in silos and it has to be in an integrated approach. But also understanding that if we are taking it in an integrated approach, and you want to now, if I go back to the indigenous knowledge systems, and you want to bring in indigenous knowledge systems into said work, it is very important to understand that these indigenous knowledge systems in and of themselves are not homogeneous. Every community is different, and every community has got different needs. I don't like the approach of, I'm coming to capacity build you with this particular data that I've learned, without opening up premise of saying, what can you teach me that I can capacitate into my own science as well, right? And most of the time, that dialogue is very difficult to happen because there's very specific structures on how to engage with said data, one, but also two, and this is something I always push back and challenge on is, and perhaps maybe the scientific community can answer me, how can you quantify cultural and spiritual practices into scientific data? Because now if we're talking about that direct translation between data and impact, if impact for people lies in cultural brevity and sometimes spirituality, which is the nature of these indigenous communities, how can you then quantify your data into what they have, and not just with the communities, but then quantifying it within the economic sector, within other scientists, within government as well. And that's a challenge we are all still trying to figure out. But I think long and short of it, the silos need to be eliminated, and there needs to be a reimagination in terms of how we understand translation mechanisms for impact.
Thank you very much for that. I'll hand over to Gustav to also share his feedback.
Hi there. So,
Hi.
I mean, quite a complicated, well, difficult question to answer in a few words. I think Yanga did a good job there. But if I must, yeah, so what do we need from government, I suppose, or I suppose, yeah, making policies and everything a little bit more seamless would be quite nice, so that's not such a complicated process. But yeah, I suppose it is quite important that we develop these collaborations across board to really tackle climate change and those sort of processes. But yeah, it's quite I suppose we are trying, and but maybe better, like, improved communication to really pin down on what needs to happen could also be quite useful. But yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you very much for that. Prof. Vogel?
Yeah, as everyone has said, is a difficult question. I just want to comment on two things. I don't think we have to translate community-based and indigenous knowledge, wisdoms, and spiritual things into data. So that's what I was trying to say. I mean, narrative and verbal information is just as strong as, a quantifiable kind of indicator. So I think we need to think hard around that and maybe opening up conversations with each other. But in terms of the issue around data, I mean, it really is a concern. We need to have accessibility of the data, affordability, and more importantly, accountability. I've been trying to do work on elderly and heat stress. We cannot get the data from anybody. We get blocked. Sometimes you have to be paying for the data unless you're a student studying, and then you get access to data. So these issues, I think, all need to be negotiated, in particular as business comes on board as well. Who pays? Where does the buck stop? And I think that needs to be taken up by, government in terms of the DFFE, perhaps through the information system that has been set up, but also then aligning it very closely to the Act. And then more critically are the ethical domains and dimensions of all of this. So it is a very, very, difficult question. Mary pointed to the United States and the geopolitics of all of this. Other countries are grappling with this as well. So maybe we can, with the G20, start doing South-South probing of what that means for those of us who are trying to keep data but enhance our data. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leo?
Thank you. Yeah, it is a difficult question, but in my perspective, I think we need to do more around the implementation of a nationally coordinated data policy. I know there are some guidelines, and there are acts that already exist, such as the Spatial Data Infrastructure, but those haven't been able to break through the silos so far. So I think coordination around that with clear implementation guidelines is necessary, in my opinion. And in the case of data aggregation as well, I think at the bare minimum, we should have like a go-to system where we can consolidate public information as well, because working with different data sources is challenging because sometimes users don't know which systems to look up and so on. So I think coordination around that for me would be one of the critical priorities.
Thank you very much. Delani, I left you for last because you could give us a perspective from a policymaker's point of view. So, Delani?
Hi, Chair.
Yes, we can hear you, Delani. Okay. I think she may be having some technical issues, and just in lieu of time, we would have really loved to hear from her, but I think we'd move on to the next question. I'm just going to quickly share. Oh, she checked the chat. Yes, it does indicate that the line is having some technical issues. I see a message. I see there are no questions in the chat for now, so the next question will come from myself. And I just wanted to know that what does an ideal open climate data system look like? And with that openness, how do we also protect sensitive data? So how do we balance having open data, but as well as the protection of sensitive data? This one also goes to the entire panel. So we can, for now, start with, let's turn the tables around. Leo?
I think for me, the point I highlighted about licenses still stands. In the case of open data, that's pretty much straightforward. But licenses can also be developed for sensitive or restricted data. So in an open ecosystem, ideally, you will have metadata for everything, regardless of sensitivity. You may want to hide specific detail if those sensitivities are great, but I think at a metadata level, things can be centralized, and then using appropriate licenses where applicable. And then also the issues of IP when it comes to researchers typically wanting to publish before they actually release the data. I think accommodating embargoes is something that can be done at a systems level.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Prof.
Yeah, again, I think there are various initiatives that are happening, and presumably through ASSAf and others, they would also be able to share with all the participants activities that are ongoing. I will just suggest the International Sciences Council, the ISC, I know has got delegations and groups working on open data, how one gets it, etc., etc. So again, doing a search like that, but I think capitalizing on, you know, the G20 and the S20, etc., in all the different platforms. I'm sure there must be people talking about this also. And then really, I think the act, what are we saying in the act? And, you know, how do we then hold people accountable, and can one hold people accountable to actually opening up data? So it's a very complicated ethical and, you know, as we've just heard, licensing, legalese, etc. in the frame. So I think it requires maybe another round for ASSAf to organize and really get down and investigate this in a much closer way. But thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I have to leave, and I think it was really great. So thank you, and apologies for leaving early.
Thank you very much, Prof. We do understand. Gustav, would you like to also share some insights based on that question?
Yeah, I mean, as I can't speak about everybody, but I know at SOMISANA, one of our challenges has been to kind of really get the metadata for all of our models so that it's a little bit more consistent throughout. But yeah, so we did have some issues like that, but you know, to really make it open, I think it obviously is very useful and valuable to the community and public. It does require some technical skills, which we are working on. And like I said, it is being developed, so that's very cool. And it's open for anybody. But in terms of a national level, I do find it quite, and it's for a reason like that, I suppose, because, but it would have been very convenient if we had like a national sort of, which we do, but I mean like, we have like various different portals in which you can access the data, and would have been very cool if it was all under one sort of portal. But I suppose that is being developed and it just takes time. But yeah, that's all really.
Oh, thank you. Yanga?
Yeah, I might not necessarily tackle the question that's been laid out. I think it's been set through quite well. I see there's two questions that have come up that I feel like are somewhat kind of directed to me. I see on the chat we had a question about indigenous practices that are informally exercised but legally unsupported, and the issue of institutional dissonance and how it can be addressed. And not to go into the legalese of things, but it's very important to recognize the fact that the irony is that our constitution supports a hybrid legal model if we're basing it from a South African perspective. And yet there's still some struggles in terms of informal practices of indigenous communities might not necessarily come out into concrete legal findings at the end, right? But there's different ways that some of these things are being intervened in, particularly with the Council of Traditional Leaders in South Africa. And a big part of those things is how that dissidence is being addressed is usually through 3 modules where they try to have community trusts. So the traditional councils in and of themselves registered legal trust while maintaining customary governance. Our legal system does allow for that to happen, that there's cooperative structures where cooperative law can be used to kind of formalize traditional collective practices. And there's also what we can understand as like traditional authority recognition, which is something that our country does really, really well, right? Where there's a strengthening of traditional leadership and the Governance Framework Act, which we do have that exists. The issue, however, is that it falls down into the other two mechanisms. So if you remember when I was talking about the data and the impact and saying that there's different ways in which you translate, it's the policy breaching mechanisms and the financial system adaptations, and trying to integrate those communities within that is where that institutional dissonance kind of occurs. And usually the best way to kind of approach it is to honestly have legal recognition zones, number one. Number two, government procurement becomes extremely important. 3, university partnerships also become important. And most importantly, bank training, because usually there's huge monies that are involved behind these things. And I can just give you an example regarding the institutional dissonance and how it was actually addressed with the Hoodia case, with the San communities that had successfully claimed rights to traditional plant knowledge, right? So that is some examples of how that has actually worked. I hope that answers that question over there. That is very complicated and very legalized. And then to answer the other question, which had to do with how relevant are indigenous knowledge systems in the G20 and in South Africa, is the implementation of indigenous mainstream science received in South Africa. I think in terms of South Africa itself, this is a clear point of the agenda in terms of the G20. And a big part of that has to do with the theme that South Africa has selected, of course, for the G20, but also how South Africa has positioned itself for this upcoming G20 of recognizing that it's the first African country to be the chair of the G20. And in it, recognizing that, it's recognizing the fact that it's not just South Africa that it's representing, but Africa as a whole. And if it's Africa as a whole that it is representing, that also means it's representing the African Union values and points of importance. And part of that, and at the core of it, is the protection of indigenous knowledge and indigenous communities across the continent. And of course, then, like I said, our constitution also reflects that. So I know that across the G20 working groups, the idea of indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge, depending on how they interact with the different working groups, is brought up. So the same way that now O20 and S20 is discussing it, the same kind of conversations are happening in B20, in Y20, etc. So it's clearly a point of priority for us. The real question, however, will be what will be the financial metric at the end of it, because understand that the G20 at the end of the day is a financial multi-governmental organization. So that's where that translation is kind of coming through, is what would be the indicators of saying that indigenous knowledge was represented fully and thoroughly right up until the final stages when the state leaders kind of present. And that's a gap that we are yet to see, and anticipating to see how it will work out in November is the best way I can answer that question too. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting to find out. And one thing for certain is that we need to invest more in our relationships and build trust with our local communities, because that's the only way they'll be able to trust us, and in order for them to share their knowledge, which can then be harvested and uptaken and then shared with the greater world. So thank you very much for that response, Yanga. In lieu of time, guys, I'd just like to say thank you once more to all our speakers, but time flies when you're having fun, and unfortunately that means that's all the time we've got for questions right now. So if any of our participants have pressing questions they'd like addressed, can you kindly please email them to the organizers, who will then share them with the speakers for responses. I will now hand over to Dr. Melusi Thwala, Manager of Science Advisory and Strategic Partnership at ASSAf and the Coordinator for the World Academy of Sciences Sub-Saharan Africa Region Partner. And he will be closing the program for us. So Dr. Thwala, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director. Firstly, I would really like to express our sincere gratitude on behalf of the Academy of Science of South Africa body at large, for all the participants who joined today's session. It's really been quite an informative session. So I would really like to express, the highest order of gratitude from ASSAf for everyone for attending today. And then to you, Program Director Galaletsang, for steering today's session smoothly. It really went smoothly on my end. I'm sure those sentiments are shared across by all the participants that we have today. It's really always quite a difficult task to run behind time and get everything going smoothly, but you did that. Congratulations to you, Galaletsang. Then I would like to thank our speakers as well in the order that they came through from DFFE, Delani Mathevula, from Veds. I understand that she's no longer there, Coleen Vogel, and then from IORAC SA, if I mentioned that correctly, we had Yanga, and then from SAEON, both Leo and Gustav. Really, colleagues, we really got quite good information from your presentations. We're sorry that you couldn't share as much as you would have liked because of the limited time that we had. But believe me, from what you shared with us today, really we got the best of the pack out of that. And then also to our partners, the Oceans 20 in hosting today's session. We are really, really grateful. These are the kinds of sessions, science engagement sessions that the Academy of Science of South Africa really pursues because it provides a platform that is neutral for all the parties, irrespective of their societal background or sectoral backgrounds, to convene on topical issues, and be informed by science on how we overcome those. And an important part of our conversations at ASSAf is something that has been raised today, the issue of indigenous knowledge as well as traditional systems. It was presented on that, these are practices that are important because they've sustained communities and societies for a long time, centuries at a certain point, in time. And I can indicate that as the Science 20 Engagement Group of the G20, this is something that is actually prioritized, and as our conversations are actually progressing, the inclusion and availing, ensuring that the space for indigenous knowledge and also traditional communities is availed as we develop, our mitigation as well as adaptation, efforts. And that is something, as Coleen mentioned earlier, we shouldn't assume that we're going to treat, our indigenous knowledge in the same peer review mechanism that we actually do with our scientific or database information systems. However, we need to take different approaches. But despite the modalities that we engage, around our indigenous knowledge and traditional systems at entirety, it is important that we open and we are inclusive, in that regard. And that is something that, as we live today, we take that message. We unfortunately couldn't have the municipalities on board. I mean, though that's an important layer within the South African system of climate change mitigation and adaptation, and we need to ensure, especially from SAEON, who seem to run some systems of data, that we raise awareness to these open systems that municipalities can access to advance the objectives at the ground level. So with just those, small remarks, and it has really been a privilege for ASSAf to jointly host today's session with our Oceans, 20 counterparts. And with that, we are really grateful And we are hoping that we will revisit some of the issues that popped out today as we go forward. It's not an end of the book itself. It could be the end of today's chapter, but the Academy of Science of South Africa really wishes that any partner or any stakeholder do approach us for us to engage on science or on a science topic in this regard. And with that, Galaletsang, thank you, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thwala. And just to echo Dr. Thwala's words, thank you to all the participants who stayed with us and were part of the webinar from start to finish. And without you, this webinar would not have been a success and it would not have been possible. So with that being said, thank you, everybody, and I'd like to close the meeting now.